Good morning guys! Sa video ito aming tatalakayin kung ano nga ba ang wet sump and dry sump. Kung ano yung mga advantages nila at disadvantages nila pagdating sa lubrication system sa ating makina. We all know pagdating sa lubrication system natin sa engine, oil yung primary na ginagamit natin para tanggalin yung friction between sa moving part din sa engine natin. At yung oil din is nakakatulong din siya para tanggalin yung heat at malinisan yung buong engine natin. May dalawa tayong system classification pagdating sa oil. Ang una ay wet sump. Ang wet sump lubrication system, yung oil niya is nakastored dun sa may pan under ng engine natin. Kumbaga yung wet sump is part na ng makina. Yung oil pan natin is nagsiserve siya as two function. Yung una ay oil tank. Ino-hold niya o iniimbak niya yung mga oil natin. Pangalawa naman is oil sump, na kung saan kinokolekt niya yung mga oil pabalik sa kanya after umikot dun sa engine natin. Sa wet sump natin, meron tayong oil pump. Yung oil pump nito, siya yung nag-help dun sa oil natin na mag-circulate sa engine natin. Bago pumasok yung oil dun sa engine, meron tayong filter para ma-avoid yung mga contaminants na mapupunta dun sa component natin. After mag-circulate ng oil natin sa buong engine, babalik ulit yun dun sa may oil sump, tapos repeat lang ulit yung process. May mga advantages and disadvantages tayo pagdating sa wet sump. Yung unang advantage is less complex. Hindi tulad sa dry sump, unti lang yung mga part niya. Pangalawa, easier and faster circulating. Since na hindi complex yung design niya, mas mabilis nakakapag-circulate yung oil natin sa buong engine. Pangatlo, hindi siya nag-a-add ng weight dun sa aircraft natin dahil yung wet sump is part na rin ng engine. At ang panghuli, less maintenance required at low cost siya. Yung disadvantages naman ng wet sump, una ay yung oil capacity niya is limited dahil dun sa size ng sump natin. Pangalawa, mahirap mapalamig yung oil since nandun siya sa imbakan niya sa engine which is mainit din. Pangatlo, isang oil pump lang yung meron siya. Kaya pag once na nag-failed yung oil pump natin, apektado yung buong engine performance.
So after ng wet sump system, punta naman tayo sa dry sump system. Dry sump system, extra oil is restored outside the engine rather than in the oil pan. So yung sabi nga ni sir, ma-identify natin kung wet or dry sump kasi yung wet sump nasa loob ng engine and yung dry sump is nasa labas naman. There are at least 2 oil pumps in a dry sump. One pulls oil from the sump and send it to the tank, and the other takes oil from the tank and send it to the to lubricate the engine. So mamaya guys, papakita ko yung animation kung paano napupul ng isang pump yung yung oil natin, and yung isang pump naman is kung paano niya nadidistribute. Dry sump system have several important advantages over wet sump. So dito na natin ipag-compare yung wet sump and dry sump. Because a dry sump does not need to have an oil big pan enough to hold under the engine. The main mass of the engine can be placed lower in the vehicle. This helps the lower center of the gravity and can also help the aerodynamics. So, yung advantage ng ating dry sump is unlike sa wet sump na built-in na siya doon sa loob, and yung dry sump natin is pwede natin piliin where kung saan natin siya pwede ilagay. So, either sa side or sa baba na. Kasi may pump naman para ma-distribute na maayos yung oil. The oil capacity of a dry sump system can be big as you want. So, ito nga yung sinasabi natin na mas bigger yung oil stored natin, mas better. In a wet sump, turning, braking, and acceleration can cause the oil to pull on side of the engine. This sloshing can dip the crankshaft into the oil as it turns or uncover the pump pickups tube. So, ayun yung on the other hand na wet sump, diba? And excess oil around the crankshaft in a wet sump can get on the shaft and cut horsepower. Some people claim improvements of as 15 horsepower by switching to dry sump. So yung advantages din ng dry sump natin is nadadagdagan na almost 15 horsepower kapag nagsiswitch sila ng wet sump to dry sump. Yun yung nadadagdag. So malaking bagay na din yun, lalo pag naglilift na yung aircraft natin. After the advantages, punta naman tayo sa disadvantages of the dry sump. So is the increase of weight, complexity, and cost from the extra pump and tank. But that's a small price to pay for such a big benefit. So yun nga guys, dahil mag-install tayo ng mas malaking tank, so mas nag-i-increase yung weight natin. And syempre yung complexity tsaka yung extra pump, mas mahirapan tayo dyan kapag nagkaroon ng leak dun sa natin, sa mga pump natin. And syempre huwag tayong manghinayang sa pressure, kasi kung mag-improve naman yung performance nun, mas better, kasi syempre worth it yung bayad natin. So yun guys, para mas maintindihan pa natin, may pinaprepare akong video para makita natin yung cycle ng dry sump system natin.
Hey, I'm Stefan Papadakis. We're here at our engine room at Papadakis Racing. Today we're going to talk about dry sump oiling systems. Let's get into what all the components are and how it all works.
Most engines use a pressurized oiling system to lubricate the internal components. There are two main types of oiling systems, wet sump and dry sump. Your typical street car uses a wet sump system, where oil lives in the oil pan in the lower section of the engine. That's where the pump pulls it up and then pumps it through all the oil passages in the engine for lubrication. These types of wet sump systems are simple, compact, and easy to manufacture. Most dry sump pans are much more shallow and closer to the crankshaft and rod, since they don't need to hold a large volume of oil like a wet sump. Actually, that's why they're called dry sump, because the scavenged sections on the pump pull out the oil from the pan until they're even pulling air. Often engine builders will design their dry sump systems to create a vacuum in the crankcase, which is shown to increase horsepower. The dry sump pump uses a belt with teeth on it, which has a gear on the snout of the crankshaft that actually has a keyway. You really don't want the pump belt to slip. That's why you wouldn't use like a normal serpentine belt. The dry sump pump runs about half the speed of the engine. These four lines at the bottom are called the scavenge lines. Each one of them has its own little slot that it pulls from inside the oil pan. The oil gets sucked into one of these four scavenge stages. They go into internal manifold and then out the top fitting right there. The last pump on the left is actually the pressure pump. That's the pump that pulls the oil from the external tank and then delivers it to the engine. Our oil pan is a little bit unique because it has this scavenge rail for fitment reasons, and also so we can put these filters inside. These are Dash 12 AN fittings that have a built-in screen on them. The reason for the screen, it's to do a pre-filter before that oil gets to the oil pump. If you have like a medium-sized particle that could damage the pump, then this will hopefully block it. In this case, this engine's been run, and I actually found a little bit of silicone on there that wouldn't really do any damage to the pump, but I gotta talk to the engine builder, to do a little bit better job with the silicone on the next assembly. This isn't an issue, but this is one of the things that the filters could trap, and that's one of the reasons that you would do it. Next, we've got the entire oil pan off. This is a billet oil pan, where this was machined out of a giant block of aluminum. Then we can put it on the table, you can see how it assembles in the engine, where it pulls in from the pan from these slots, through the screen, up through the lines, and then through the scavenge pump, out the Dash 16, and out to the main tank. So let's go deeper with the design of the system. When oil is on the spinning crankshaft, the oil gets sucked into each one of the slots in the oil pan. If we used a single pump and teed it into 4 separate sections, the pan would need to fill with oil over all of those sections, slots in the oil pan, in order for it to draw oil, because the pump would just pull air from the uncovered slot before pulling in oil from the other slot. It's kind of like when you have a stuffy nose and only one nostril works. When you breathe in, the air is sucked in through the clear nostril, not the blocked one, since it takes the path of least resistance. Having a pump for each inlet slot allows each section to work independently and scavenge more oil. Let's pull apart the pump and see how it works. Once we get the main studs out that hold the assembly together, we can pull off the front bearing plate. After that, we'll pull one of the outer housings off for one of the scavenge sections, followed by the rotor set. These are what actually pump the oil or scavenge the oil out of the pan. This type of pump is called a Roots type, similar to a supercharger, but instead of pumping air into the intake of the engine, these are pumping oil and air out of the crankcase. The housing and the rotors are made out of aluminum, and the housing is hard anodized to reduce wear. Oil from the 4 scavenge stations are pumped into an internal manifold and then out through a -16 AN fitting and back to the oil tank where it is held. Then the pressure pump pulls it from the external tank, pumps it out through the oil filter, out to an oil cooler, and then back into the engine. The pressure pump is a little different than the scavenge pumps. It uses a style of gear called a spur gear. Depending on the width of the gear, this will change the volume of oil it will pump.
So, yun guys, sana may natutunan kayo sa amin ng partner ko, si Mr. Abdullah. Nakapart niyo yung wet sump system and syempre sa akin, yung dry sump system. Yan. Thank you for watching guys.